Hey, what's up, Liron here, and in this video I'm going to show you how I paint this strongly sunlit seascape. I hope you're going to enjoy this process and really seeing how adding the darks makes the huge difference. So without further ado, let's get to it. So here we go, drawing stage. Now, what I absolutely love about these kinds of scenes is the drawing is very simple. These are natural elements, so the only pretty much straight line you have to learn how to know how to draw is the horizon, and then everything else is a very irregular kind of patternless thing. Now the challenge sometimes is getting that patternless look. No patterns in nature. Well, there are plenty obviously, but when you're drawing it you want to keep things to a large degree lacking in patterns so that it doesn't feel too repetitive, too human-made. You want it to look natural. So what we have here are just these rock formations, the ones that are up close that I'm sketching right now. We have all of those beautiful ripples in the water and the highlights that we have to make sure to skip. And a very enjoyable scene in my opinion. I like the balance of elements here in terms of shapes, which is something I talk about but I didn't dive really deep into, but here you can really see it. There are a bunch of really big shapes that could be looked at like the sky and the ocean, but then we have also the rock formations, and then we have small tiny shapes like the smaller rocks, the ripple effects, so you get a bit of everything in this scene in a way, which is absolutely beautiful. So here we go with the painting process. Now one thing you'll note is that I actually, after filming everything and finishing and getting ready to edit the video, I noticed that I made a mistake with the sky being too light, so you will see me fix it later on, but in the conclusion of the video it's going to be the older version. Just something to have in mind. I will remind you in a moment and explain again, but in any case, flat wash for the sky. It's the right value right now, but don't forget that it dries much lighter, which is where I made the mistake. Should have gone a little darker here. If you look at the left side, especially where there's a bright, almost perfectly white highlight at the far distance above that left rock, farther rock, this is where the sky appears to be darker than the highlight on the ocean, and I missed that effect, so you'll see. But for now what I'm doing is starting to hit those turquoises and phthalo blues that are a little more greenish, because if you compare the sky's a little more, at least to me, look a little more ultramarine, maybe a bit more cerulean, but the water has a bit of green in it. So I switched over to phthalo blue. Now here we get to the point with all the ripples. So what I'm trying to do is just be careful to leave enough highlights. So many times I've messed it up and went over some of these beautiful paper fresh highlights, and as soon as you cover them up, you will never get them to look the same. Even if you lift back with a tissue, even if you pour back water there, it's always going to be just a little bit darker. So I really took care to not cover anything that's necessary. Now I have no idea what I'm doing here. Probably had a hair on the brush and I cleaned it off. But in any case, I'm very careful. And here you see I lifted back this section in the distance to make it as light as possible, because it's such a wet wash and it was still still pretty wet and light. I could lift some of it, but again, it will never be the same as just pure paper. Now, it is important for me to go over some of the rocks already at this stage and not kind of keep them completely empty, just because it'll make things easier later on when I'm darkening, but nothing more than that. Now the main key part here is leaving that big highlight on the left section. Now if you look at the reference photo, there are actually quite a lot of details on that highlight. There are the rocks in the middle, there are ripples in the water. The rocks I'm gonna get now in just a few moments, but the ripples I'm saving for later. You will see just maybe after this dries a little, but I'm not sure. It doesn't even matter that much, but what you want to do is work slowly in that regard, because you want to make sure you don't cover anything you don't want to cover. So take it easier and slower now, and later, once you have the full picture of what's highlight and what's not, you can go a little more crazy and add some small details, but and darken whatever needs darkening. But for now, I'm very careful with this left section. You see, so I'm just going over some of the rocks, maybe some of the patterns in the water, and that will provide a beautiful shiny effect. Now the point where the shiny effect will really kick in and you'll really feel it, you'll really see it, is once I get the darks for the rocks, because right now, again, we lack the context of the entire painting. So you see now, after I'm finished with the rocks and the main stuff, I'm just adding a few ripples very carefully. I'd rather be on the light side and on the sparse side, scarce side with the ripples than to go overboard and cover up the white, maybe make it look less natural. Now you'll have to forgive me because I forgot to turn on the camera. I just stopped it for a minute and turned it back on and did wet in wet. Okay, so whatever you see me doing now, most of the middle section is still wet, and so you'll see some movement. The right section, what I'm doing right now, is a little drier. Okay, but in the middle, you'll see in just a moment, I put in details and they kind of melt into the previous layer. Because if you look at the reference, this section is a little darker. All of the ocean actually should be a little darker, which is why I'll later work on the top section as well. The reason I'm not working on it now is that it's perfectly dry. Now I'm starting with this. Again, this is the last time I forgot to turn on the camera. I don't know why, I had a bad streak. But in any case, started with a stronger turquoise, covering up the rock, okay, making it easier for myself to make it darker later. And I'm going to pull that wash all the way down to where I see the water turning a little lighter. Okay, so on the left section, that's easy. It's where the highlights are. And again, even now, I want to pay attention to not destroy that random pattern I created between the water and the normal water and the sunlit water. On the left side and the right side, you want to make sure to have that interesting edge in between the shapes, to have that interesting balance between them. It's not always easy to get it right, but it was really important for me. Here you see I'm kind of carefully not going over what's already been left as white. Now I'm using this chance to put in just a bit of darker wet and wet here in the middle, because notice that lower right section is very muted as well. So it's kind of dark and muted. Now I should have probably muted this color a bit more, which I may do later on, but you know, just trying to get it to be darker, probably should have gone a little more muted again. And once again, a reminder, when the effect is really going to kick in is now, when I'm adding the shadows. Now, one more thing, look at those rock formations. They aren't, for the most part, black. Okay, they're fairly light, especially their top parts, which is a little more exposed to the sun. And also you have that beautiful effect of the sun pouring through the rocks, which further makes them appear lighter. So I'm very careful not to use like a fully dark black color here. What I could have done is probably add a bit more yellow to the top part, make it a little warmer, but that's fine. Now, as I get to the center of this rock formation, I can afford to go a little darker, which is what you see here. And then as I get to the bottom, I'm going to go back to some light colors as well, because it's very subtle and it's almost not something you'll be able to notice. But you will subconsciously, you will notice if I've gone too dark, you will see it and it will hurt the impression. Okay, it will flatten out these rocks, and you don't want them to appear flat. You want them to appear three-dimensional and full of richness in them and a variation of values in them. Now, one important thing always to have in mind when we're talking about shapes is their outline, the patterns on it. Not just the general shape, but the micro, smaller shape. So this rock I got there, and you can see it in the reference as well. All of these small connections around the bottom of larger shapes are really important. For these small rocks, there isn't as much of that. It's just one shape. But for larger shapes, you can get the mini shapes within them. What you call primary shapes, secondary, tertiary shapes. So the overall structure is enriched by the smaller shapes within it. Now this rock to the right is a little darker, as you can tell, but still I'm being quite careful not to go as dark. And an important note at this stage of the painting, I have spent a long time mixing. Okay, for the first wash, for these rocks, I cut out most of it because it really is just long and it's just me adding colors, removing colors, adding more colors, adding more water. But take into consideration, a long time out of this process was actually the mixing. So take your time, as I always say, mix enough. Make sure you mix a large enough quantity and an accurate enough value and an accurate enough color if you're interested in that. be sure to really be patient at this stage, because same goes for this part. Look at the dark paint I'm applying. It took me a long time to mix that, so don't think it just I did it easily. Okay, it really did take a lot of time. Now notice how I'm leaving some lighter gaps here. Here I'm allowing myself to go a little darker on the lights as well. You'll notice that the left side of this rock is sunlit, but I'm still going dark. Why? Because it's closer. So that way I'll get that feeling of depth with the rocks that are farther. You choose what to emphasize. You choose where to strengthen the darkness, where to weaken it. If you look at artists like Joseph Zbukvich, one of the ways that he achieves personally a lot of the sense of depth and beauty is those nuances in value. Even if something in the distance is a little darker, he will make it lighter on purpose to get that sense of depth and distance. And he's a master of it, and because he's using such subtle colors, what he does is really hard, and he gets just a spectacular result for that. So have that in mind. You are responsible for the values. You can go darker, lighter than what is actually there, okay? I said make the rock a little lighter. Go darker if you see if it fit, okay? If you think that'll work better. Now, while I'm at it, I'm adding some of these more prominent ripples that you see, mostly in the foreground, but also in the middle ground, background. There are some of these shapes that I wanted to add just in order to enhance the impression. Now, already there's a decent, let's say, sense of light and shadow. The next stages are where I'll struggle a bit more. You'll see me. It's very funny because I wasn't expecting this. Usually the hard part is the second wash. Sometimes the first wash as well, depending on the scene. And the final touches and details are kind of easy. Now, you will see with this process, once I add in the opaque lights and the subtle variations, and also the sun's rays, you'll see me really having a hard time. I don't know why. So first off, I'm darkening this rock to the right. Look how light it dried. Felt like I had to push it to be a little darker. And once I'm finished with that, you will see me trying to get that effect of the sun rays. So if you look at the rock, especially on the left, the sun kind of pours around it and casts these beautiful rays, kind of like what you'd see in a forest, in a very dense forest with the sunlight shining through. Now, I had a really hard time with this effect here for some reason. A couple of problems I had. I went too much for a pattern, and it really, you will see in just a moment, it feels too set. The distances are all equal. Plus, I think I used too thick of a brush, and so the sun rays didn't feel much like rays. You'll see now. So I'm just wetting this area, drying the brush, and then scrubbing off some of the paint. Now, this is a relatively thick ray of light. And so the next ones have to be thinner, but what I ended up doing accidentally is still going with quite thick ones. This brush, as thin as it gets, it's actually not thin enough in many cases. So you need a smaller rigger brush sometimes for these details, and I'll learn for the next time. It's just too thick of a highlight that I pick here, and also in the next part. In the distance, I wasn't paying enough attention. The distances are set, and it just goes to show you how pattern oriented we are, even when we know we shouldn't be. It kind of feels like the same in a way, you know. Again, the distances aren't perfectly equal, but look at that. It's like the same kind of line. Then I'll do the same on the right side. Now I'm trying to remedy it a bit by picking up something closer to that first mark I made. Kind of helps it, but not really. The angle isn't good enough. It's not aimed at the right direction. It should be aimed at the corner when it's actually aimed more above the rock. Now, if you connect all of these lines, you'll see it leads you to above the rock rather than the left side, the left corner. So this effect is not good enough in my opinion, and I kind of struggle with it, which is again funny because that's usually the point where I'm doing okay. Now also in a few moments I'll add some white highlights with my opaque white watercolor called Jaune Brilliant by Shinhan PWC. And as a reminder, this is watercolor. You'll see in a moment it's not gouache, it's watercolor. And also with that stage I'm kind of struggling. And notice one more thing, I did these way too strong. I should have probably covered up the entire left rock with another wash and get rid of some of that lightness. In fact, I may do that. The painting is right in front of me. Who knows? Maybe I can fix it even more. But it's part of it. It's a learning experience. And to be honest, this effect is not something I do often. So I'm not well adjusted and well accustomed to doing it. So that's something for me to feel not as bad about, because really it is not something I do often, and I do need to practice it. And maybe we'll make a video dedicated to that. Let me know if that's something you're interested in. I usually don't go for the tacky, what I call tacky effects, or for the gimmicky moves, but I like to rely more on where I place the paint rather than how. But it's just another thing. So here we go, adding some opaque touches of opaque paint. What I could have done is added a bit more highlights to the water with it too. Could have done more of, at least. I didn't do much of that. You will notice some rocks here capture the light, the light by the sun, and so I wanted to get that effect going. Now here's the thing. Look at the sky. My sky is much lighter than the not much, but it is lighter than the reference photo, and that hurts the impression, because again, look at the left section. There should be a contrast between the water and the sky that's a little stronger. So I'm actually going to do that in just a few moments, kind of fix it up. After removing the tape, I'm retaping it. And make sure, if you're making corrections, to large areas of the painting, make sure you retape around it. Put the tape again. Otherwise, you may regret it when you go over the edge, the clean edge you previously established. You want to make sure that doesn't happen. And it's funny because I painted this one yesterday, but I did the correction today, and it's always like that. You'll always notice things that are lacking in your work after the fact. It's only a matter of how much is it really important to do the fix. Okay, it's just very often it's just not that important, especially if you're just practicing. But if it is, and if it's work for clients or something like that, definitely be a perfectionistic, do things as best as you can. So here I am removing the tape for the first time. And this is the result I got. It's really obvious how much darker the sky should be, and it shows you that I'm also sometimes trapped in these misconceptions of how I interpret the reference. The rock on the left should be much, much darker. Again, a lot of problems, and that's fine. It doesn't mean I don't like the painting, by the way, so you have to make that separation. I like pretty much everything I produce. But in any case, here I'm going to mix some blue paint for the sky. And I believe I forgot to cut out the mixing, so here you go. You get an example of just how long it takes sometimes to mix. I'm going to move it a bit. And look at how I retaped it just around the sky, just to make sure I don't go outside the border. Sorry if you heard that. That's a wind knocked the door, shut the door. So here I am putting in some blue, and this is tricky. Okay, I should have gone with more French ultramarine. By the way, just now I realize another thing. Should have gone with French ultramarine, not with phthalo blue. I wasn't thinking, because now it kind of competes with the sea. So, colors aren't the most important thing, I always say, but sometimes they are kind of important. So my bad around this section. And notice the water looks much more turquoise than the sky looks much more turquoise than the water, which isn't the effect I wanted. Now here I'm going with almost a dry brush, but it's not enough to blend the edge. So here I am, just a piece of tissue, and here we go, wiping it off. Now look at this thin, cloudy kind of highlight there. I want to make sure I get that in as well, so I'm going to have to put in a bit of a darker color or value underneath. Continue it like that. And this will create that white gap. I'm going to wet this area again just to make to keep it blended and come back with the tissue. Okay, always you won't know exactly what works the first time around, so you kind of have to try again and again and see what works. Not always it will be as obvious. But now we got the sky to be of a slightly darker value. I'm going over it once again, a big risk. Because you may get now streaks by the brush. So I'm going to take my water sprayer, spray some on it, and it helps it move and kind of blend a little bit together. Okay, and then what you'll see me do is I'll probably just dry it with a hairdryer in a few moments, get it to look drier, and then remove the tape again, and hopefully the impression's a little better. The sky makes a little more sense. But if you compare my sky and the original sky, it really should have been much more ultramarine oriented, much more red in it in a way, rather than yellow, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. But in any case, here it is, removing the tape. Now I'm going to let you see it from up close, so I'm going to raise it. I hope you enjoyed this process. Again, seeing me struggle a bit is fun, and now we can wrap it up face to face. So thank you so much for watching once again. I hope you enjoyed the process. If you want to learn how to paint like me, be sure to check out the frustration-free watercolor course. Link is always in the description box below. And I do want to remind you again, I'm doing live sessions. So every Thursday, 9 a.m. Eastern time, I'm going to also post here in the community tab. So you have a link where you can join a wait room and wait for the live. Now we're going to paint together, chat together, draw together. And I think a lot of you are going to enjoy this upcoming live. I'm going to talk about 3D perspective, a lot of fun stuff. So be sure to tune in. Thank you so much for tuning into this video, and I will see you again in the next one real soon.